Hey there, I'm Derek McDaniel. This is Econ is Culture, and today I'm going to talk about three important concepts. Language is the thing we use to communicate with one another. It's how we express our ideas, it's how we make our intent known to each other, and even how we create those intentions in the first place. Okay, so in addition to language, we're going to then talk about land. So we happen to live on a ball, a very big ball for us at least. We live on a ball, and so we have to move around on the surface of this ball, and we have to avoid running into each other. And so we divide up space or territory, and that's why land is an important issue in economics. And finally, we're going to talk about privilege. Now, privilege gets a lot of attention in politics, and especially liberal politics, and that's important to discuss. I think we need to talk about privilege. I don't want to think about privilege as a bad thing, though, just as an aspect of our relationships. Okay, so certain people have privileges and even rights. Like, we can talk about that as a form of privilege. At some point, thousands of years ago, humans first developed writing. But before we even had writing, we had speaking and oral traditions. And oral traditions were an important part of culture and knowledge, and that allowed culture to develop in a community and knowledge to get passed from one generation to the next. So even before we had oral language, or oral traditions and verbal language, there could have been a time, or there likely reasonably was a time when we lacked that verbal language, when we couldn't talk with each other, and the best we had was very basic vocal ways to communicate. If you look at other animals, they have, like, for the most part, they don't have language abilities. Like, some primates can use language, some dogs can learn a decent amount of vocabulary, but for the most part, they just have very basic vocal communication where they grunt or laugh, or, well, I don't know about laughter, but let's imagine early humans could laugh. They yell, they cry, and even without verbal language, vocal communication can be very rich and expressive. Like, if you've ever been a dog owner, you know that dog is not stupid, okay? The dog knows what's going on. But once you get language, then you can take that a whole step forward. And when evaluating human economies, like, language is going to be a feature that's going to be required, a part of all these evaluations. I want you guys to think of language as a technology. And I would define technology as useful tools or processes that require knowledge. So, language, how is it a technology? Well, language requires knowledge, first of all. You have to have vocabulary, you have to have a grammar, you have to have knowledge of culture, and you even have to have, like, this form of what musicians might call performance knowledge to be able to speak, to make our muscles make the sounds, so, and to be able to hear and listen. So there's a lot of knowledge required to use language. So I would definitely say language is a technology. And technology always has a big impact on history. It always changes human society. Our values change, our processes change, our relationships change. Another thing with language I want to talk about is when we, as humans, make decisions today, it almost always involves language. Even if we're just thinking in our own head, what am I going to have for dinner? What's in my refrigerator? We're using language in our own head to perform our decision making. So when these primitive human groups had vocalizations and before they had verbal language, or how do they use this social technology? Because communication is a social technology. Um, how do they use that? Well, first we see probably the first thing is mating calls. That was one of the first uses of communication. Then what's another use? So, um, when, as life became social, like um, it lives in groups for certain advantages, and one of those advantages is just like sharing knowledge of like dangers and resources, and dividing resources equally so you can have more stable. Like life requires stability because it basically succeeds through sustainability, like the ability to perpetuate our values and our existence is what allows us to live. So, the environment you live in can have a lot of randomness, and that's not the most conducive thing for sustainability. It is not the most conducive thing to survive, to perpetuate. So, if we live in groups, that helps us in two ways. First of all, some of the individuals may survive, even if not all of them do. But secondly, if our resources like come in random spurts, like we can, as a group, like as individuals, we might get a lot of resources one time and not many another time. But we can sort of stabilize that. So, um, that's just a few of the advantages of social life. And then finally, a very basic use of communication is to divide up territory. And that brings us to the second subject, which is land. If you're an animal defending your territory, you're gonna roar, for example. And then, like, other creatures, no matter what they are, like, as long as they have the ability to hear, they'll recognize that signal. It's not just a signal internal to your social group or clique or club. It's a universal signal that you're going to be territorial, that you're going to defend this area because that's how you manage your resources. You need that space to manage your resources and to live. You need that space to live. So, land, that's why land is such an important issue in economics and social science and biology and all these subjects because it's required for life. Like, it's the space we live in. Like I said, we're on a ball. It's a two-dimensional surface. We have to negotiate our movements and use of resources on that surface. So, land is incredibly important, and language is involved with that. So, if you look, let's get back to language for a second. If you look at these ancient or primitive uses for language, or basic, not necessarily primitive, let's just say basic. Mating, herd signaling, and territory, you still see those as critical aspects of communication in the world today. So how does that work? Let's say you turn on the radio, or you turn on Pandora Stream, or Spotify, I guess, is what the kids use these days. You turn on your music, what are you going to hear? Well, you're going to hear mating calls or love songs. Like 90% of the music that plays is love songs. So it gets back to these basic communication needs. Now, let's say you go walk outside. You're in a town or a city or some type of community. What are you going to see in your environment? What are the first things you're going to see? Well, you're going to see houses, you're going to see roads, you're going to see signs, buildings, walls, streets. Okay? Now, a lot of these structures we may think of them as simply uh, like a building is to protect us from our elements, but that's not the only purpose. One purpose of these structures, and or like a road, is to allow us to travel, and that's one purpose. But the secondary purpose is to partition space. So we appropriate a certain space for a certain use, and our structures in our communities and like our lawns are like their purpose is to like delineate space or territory. So it just goes to show like how important land is. Um, and the final thing I wanted to talk about with this is like herd signaling, and that's very similar to the news. Like when we turn on the news, we'll hear warnings of danger or like signals of opportunity for food or resources. I mean, advertising, you're going to see a lot of food advertised, but like even people talking about stocks going up and down, like that's the signaling about resources. So these basic and primitive uses for communication are still relevant to us today. Like they're still the focus. Um, so now we've talked about language and land and their connections. I want to get into privilege. Human society involves many different spheres of interaction. We aren't just one thing. We aren't just like a worker or we aren't a brother or a parent. Like we have different roles in a lot of different spheres. There's family life, work life, political life, community life, and even just like having fun with your friends involves a certain sphere of social interaction. And if we were to go back and look at history, like these different spheres might not look recognizable today. Like we think about families as something that has always existed, but in earlier human societies, like can you say a tribal structure, social structure, is the same as a family that we might see today or might be the norm, the normative expectation of a lot of society today? No, like a tribe is going to be a group of people. It's going to be structured differently from a family, and it's going to play a different role because it also played more of a political role. And at different points in history, we have had these political and social spheres have looked different. Like in ancient Greece, they had city-states, and they would often fight with one another. I imagine for resources or whatever reason, they would fight. And it's these kind of things that economics has to be able to explain. If it just like says, oh, our GDP will go up if we set this tax rate policy. No, like we have to be able to explain how we relate to one another. And it's nice when we can actually get it into quantitative terms, like these numerical things like GDP, employment levels, but it needs to be qualitative first. And I think this is where a lot of people get lost. Like, and if your qualitative assessment is bad or wrong or invalid or just if it's fragile, I think usually they aren't completely wrong, they're just fragile. They depend on assumptions, and those assumptions aren't explicitly articulated. So when conditions change, then it's like, oh, what's going on? Why is there a bubble crash? Like, what is the response? And you just have to look at these qualitative things. And it's easier for most people to do these qualitative assessments than the complex mathematics. You need to get highly detailed statistical predictions of GDP and stock prices and get a nice package of hedged derivatives in your asset balance sheet portfolio. Like, it's much easier for us to say, oh, are like people, these two people had to break up because they weren't getting along, or our country had a social crisis. Like it's much easier for us to relate to this, and these are more robust concepts. So they actually tell us information that the detailed mathematics won't do automatically unless we can express these very general type categorical type ideas in mathematical terms, which isn't always necessary, and it won't necessarily provide new insights that our qualitative assessments can't tell us. Yeah. So basically, in certain social spheres, that's where privilege exists. So, like I said at the beginning, I don't want to think of privilege as a bad thing. It just is an aspect of our relationships. And certainly it can be a bad thing. Like, slavery is a terrible privilege. Like, you can't you can't say you're, well, even rational, but empathetic. You can't say you're empathetic if you enslave other beings, other human beings. Like, you aren't an empathetic person if you do stuff like that. And I am not the most emotional guided person. I'm more rational based, but like even like I still have at least a little bit of that empathy and sympathy to like, and I try to like be sensitive to that because that allows us to understand other people. Like it's just it's like both more utilitarian effective and just like part of being human. So I get really concerned when people like have certain ideas about how economics is supposed to work and utility maximization and profit maximization, but those ideas override their sensitivity to social concerns. Like that is really troubling because like we call behaviors like that psychopathic or sociopathic for a reason. Like because it's just not an effective way to live. It's just not good. Um, yeah, this video was longer than I wanted, but I think I talked about everything. Uh, we want privilege to be a good thing. We want our obligations. We want to feel committed to our obligations and not overburdened by them. And so I wanted to talk about these basic concepts before I get into anything like money or debt or stock option derivatives or GDP metrics, like all this stuff. Let's get these basics out of the way. Language, land, and privilege before we can talk about those other stuff. And then hopefully we have a good foundation where we can talk about these more detailed ideas and make sure they're accurate within our scope, and we delineate the context when the idea is valid and when it breaks down. And that's my pet peeve with a lot of economics, is that it's not very explicit, and it doesn't prioritize these discussions. And I really think these kind of discussions should be a high priority. Tell me your own thoughts. Tell me if you liked the video. Sorry it was so long, but if you made it through the whole thing, kudos to you. But even if you just watched parts, tell me what you thought. And yeah, I want to have discussions of these ideas, so that's why I do this. And thanks for watching. Okay, have a good day.